For the last video in this series, we're going to talk about challenges to evidence. So what can get in the way of evidence really making the point it's meant to in argumentative writing, even if everything is sound. So even if you've asked yourself all the tough questions examining a piece of evidence from the videos on statistics, surveys, and sources, what could still get in the way of having this be an effective part of your writing? The big one that I want to talk about to start is correlation versus causation. If you've taken a statistics course, this is a very familiar concept. We're not going to get too deep into it, but just a basic overview. When we say correlation, we mean showing that two things are related. Causation is showing that one thing causes another. Okay? And they are not the same. That's really important. Just because two things are related doesn't mean that one causes the other. When we talk about this in math terms, we say that just because B follows A doesn't mean that A causes B. They could both be caused by a third factor, right? We've got a great example of that here. In a few weeks, you'll watch a clip that also brings up these maps, but this is part of a conspiracy theory that 5G was causing the coronavirus, right? So at the top here in this photo, we have a map of the United States where the red circles, right, indicate outbreaks of the coronavirus, right? With the larger the circle, I believe having the bigger the impact. In this second photo down here, we also have a map of the United States, this time with red dots for where new 5G towers have been put in place. Okay. So a lot of people would look at these two maps, and they were trying to imply that there was causation here, that because they looked somewhat similar, this 5G was causing this coronavirus. Okay. That is causation, but in truth, these are more correlated, okay, meaning that the two things are just related. It's true that we see a lot of overlap between the red dots in the top map and the red dots on the bottom, but this is also in line with the population, right? We see the more populated areas, it makes sense, have more need for cell reception. They also have more people who can contract this virus. So in this case, we have correlation, where yes, the two things are related, but they are both caused by a third factor, in this case, population density. Another way that evidence can be kind of misused, even if the numbers themselves are sound, is through something called the Posthoc Fallacy. This just means that you imply or assume that because there's a statistical trend towards something, that it will happen to you. Right? So it's a fallacy or an incomplete idea to assume that because statistics points to this, that it is guaranteed to happen. It's not a fortune teller, it's not an omen or something. It's just a general trend, right? So for example, if a study shows that smokers get lower grades, it is technically a fallacy to assume that if you smoke, you will get lower grades, right? Obviously, there's a connection there in the study, so it's important to keep that in mind, but it doesn't mean that one thing will magically lead to the other. Rather, it just increases the chances, according to this study. Another really important topic that comes up a lot in True Enough is this idea of selective exposure. And this is a big barrier to evidence. We see this a lot right now, frustratingly, where you can still choose to ignore evidence and to ignore sources if they challenge your worldview. Maybe you did the hard work, you looked into the mission statement of the group publishing evidence, you looked into their survey practices and everything was good, but it still just doesn't connect with what you already believe yourself. Selective exposure says that you're just going to ignore that source. You're going to mentally toss it out the window and assume that it is flawed for some other reason. Selective exposure can be frustrating because it really doesn't matter how convincing the evidence is, people can still choose to ignore it. There were all sorts of studies where this was shown. I believe it comes up in True Enough as well, with being able to turn up the volume on something, and people turned up the volume on radio segments that tended to agree with what they already believed. If it was kind of off track from what they already believed, they would leave the static running. And the last barrier is cognitive dissonance. This is another big one that comes up a lot in our reading and in our world. Cognitive dissonance can be best explained as changing the facts to match your opinions, rather than changing your opinions based on facts presented. So a lot of us have the idea that if we believe a certain thing and we come across somebody who believes the opposite as us, if we present them with enough solid evidence, we will be able to persuade them and change their minds. A lot of you know this is not already the case. A lot of you talked about this in your first blog post response, and you're aware that sometimes that's not enough to get somebody to change their mind. That is the case with cognitive dissonance. It's where you dismiss the incoming facts so that you can keep your opinions, rather than changing your opinions based on the incoming facts. I think it's really greatly described by the author of True Enough, where they say the mental acrobatics people engage in when they're confronted with two or more dissonant or different thoughts. This theory was first proposed by Leon Festinger in 1957. He studied a lot of doomsday cults and tried to figure out what was it mentally that led people to stay in a cult. So he would work with a cult that said, the end of the world is going to be this date. And then he followed them past that date. And how did they handle the fact that the world had continued and everything that they had built their identity around was not true? Well, they just changed the facts and they said, oh, well, it was actually supposed to be this date instead. Or they would say that they were able to prevent that end of the world by doing X, Y, or Z. In general, cognitive dissonance is based on the fact that we as humans have a really hard time taking in new information that disagrees with what we think we already know. This is not a personal flaw. It just means that our brains are already hardwired in some cases to accept certain truths, and it can be very hard for us to take in something that's different from that. And so cognitive dissonance is the easier route. It's easier to not need to change your mind and to dismiss whatever incoming news there is. That's a lot easier than having to sit there and re-examine things. We see this a lot in the news, especially with when a case comes out about a celebrity. I don't want to name any specific ones. You always have other fellow celebrities that stand by that first accused celebrity side and say, oh, that's not the so-and-so that I know, right? We have a really hard time taking in new information about a person, and it's easier just to stick to what we already know. So cognitive dissonance can also be a really big barrier, along with the other ones here, to having evidence actually make a difference in argumentative writing.